Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a bit of a geopolitical analysis on the impact of the national security strategy document. I've talked about it a lot, and yeah, you could say I'm recovering old news, but actually there's a bit more analysis to go on, and I'm going to look at it in the context of the statements yesterday from not least the General Secretary of NATO, Mark Rutte, and also others concerning Russia as a threat to European security, that NATO is saying that Russia sees us in NATO as a next target. And actually, that should cause the US to be very robust in its response to Russia, but actually it's pivoting in exactly the opposite direction. And so we have Houston, we have a problem, and we need to talk about it. Anyway, before we get stuck into the nitty gritty, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That really helps out the channel. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and select all rather than personalized, and you get all the updates, keeping you in the loop. Okay, let's get to it. Right, so we're going to go first to Mark Rutte. I'm not going to play you the video. I'm just going to read out part of the transcript. Quote, "We are Russia's next target. We have to shift to a wartime mindset. Ukraine must have what it needs to defend itself. Russia is losing 1,200 soldiers a day. If Putin is prepared to sacrifice ordinary Russians in this way, what is he prepared to do to us? 80% of critical components in Russian drones and missiles are made in China. China is a lifeline for Russia's war. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. Conflict is at our door. We must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured, i.e. World War I and World War II. Imagine it, a conflict reaching everyone home, everyone's home, everyone's workplace, destruction, mass mobilization, millions displaced. But if we deliver on our commitment, this is a tragedy we can prevent." So he's advocating for, 3.5% of GDP spent on NATO will soon look like child's play. We need to be spending on defense in order to be able to act as a deterrence against Russia, or to be able to do something should Russia actually invade. He is sounding the alarm bells. It's what I've been saying for a long time. In fact, I gave that public presentation in Stockbridge in Hampshire last year when I was talking about how we are involved in World War III. We just don't realize it. Most people don't realize it. Well, this is Rutte's point. And many others in Europe are saying that actually Russia are at war with us. We might not realize it, but Russia are at war with us, even if we don't accept that we are at war with them. I think we need to go beyond this kind of, yeah, we're involved in a hybrid war with them kind of position, which allows it to be a bit vague and nebulous. I think our populations need to be concerned. We need to, I'm not talking about sort of scaring our population purposefully for some kind of manipulative purpose. Our populations, the average Joe that's out on the streets, needs to know that Russia are the bad guys and that we are in their crosshairs in Europe. And actually the United States, they are happily still involved, no doubt, in cyber attacks on the US, hybrid warfare involving the United States. We have the UK Defence Minister Al Khan's saying, quote, "The shadow of war is knocking on Europe's door." And that was at the launch of the new military intelligence service. He stressed that NATO must prepare for wars of necessity and not choice. Intelligence threats, mainly from Russia, Iran, and China, have surged 50% over the past year. Just this last year, a 50% surge in intelligence threats from those three nations. And they are in lockstep, it seems, in close unison. UK Defence Minister warns a shadow of war knocking on Europe's door. That is the kind of language I think we need. But how much did that seep into the public consciousness? This is, okay, Politico Pro reporting that. Is that being reported on BBC News, Sky News? GB News won't in the UK because they're all pro-reform who seem to be in bed with Russia. How much does our general public know? They're not consuming mainstream media, and even then, unlikely to know that. How much do our populations realize that Russia really are the threat that they truly are? Now, here we have Europe says former NATO leaders issue a stark warning. It's come from United 24 but also, from those former NATO leaders. Europe, not just Ukraine, is at war. Russia's hybrid operations across the continent now reach the level of, and it goes on. So, there's a stark warning here, as reported on NATO 24. Europe is already at war. Former NATO leaders issue a stark warning, so on and so forth. Actually, the rendering of this report isn't great, but a whole bunch of former NATO peeps have issued a warning shot to European leadership. Russia's hybrid warfare is here, isn't it? Russian threats and targeted action against Europe are not isolated incidents. They form a centrally planned and managed campaign designed to destabilize European societies, test Europe's resilience and resolve, and weaken the transatlantic bond. Russia is using a wide toolkit: sabotage of critical infrastructure, subversion, cyber attacks, disinformation and propaganda, GPS jamming of civilian aircraft, damaging undersea cables, drone incursions over EU territory, and operations targeting critical and commercial infrastructure, as well as our democratic institutions, have all been observed in recent days, months, and years. Hybrid warfare campaigns work best in polarized societies, and what we are witnessing through these measures is exacerbating polarization, eroding trust, and dividing communities. Therefore, countering disinformation, protecting media independence, and building public trust must be strategic security priorities. None of this is new. These tactics have been part of Russia's active measures for a century. The novelty lies in the scale, frequency, growing boldness, and openness of these operations. Russia's purpose is clear: deter Europe from supporting Ukraine by weakening public support, prepare the ground for future escalation, and crucially, sow doubt about NATO's Article 5 pledge, the very foundation of the transatlantic security apparatus. Russia does not hide its intent. It openly claims it is war with NATO, at war with NATO and Europe. This narrative is a central theme in its domestic propaganda to justify the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by portraying it as resistance to Western expansionism. With Washington searching for a quick end to the war, prioritizing speed, money, and backroom deals over lasting peace, Moscow sees Europe as a main obstacle because it continues to support Ukraine to resist and push back Russian advances. Also, because Europe refuses to accept the Kremlin's terms. So, taken individually, each hybrid incident committed or sponsored by Russia has been calibrated to remain below thresholds that would trigger stronger NATO and European responses, let alone trigger Article 5. Taken together, this is a really important point. Like, each of these little things that they're doing, actually, I don't think they're little, they're fairly significant, but they're enough, or they're not enough, to really trigger a robust response. But actually, when you see them cumulatively, this is a really concerted effort by Russia to destabilize Europe. So it all falls below that threshold. Failing to acknowledge this reality makes it truly difficult to develop effective and robust countermeasures to deter further escalation, and risks opening the way for much worse scenarios. Weak reactions to Russia's aggressions against Ukraine in 2014 and Georgia in 2008 have led us to where we are today and serve as stark reminders. Okay, so on and so forth. Really, really important here. Add to this, Denmark's military intelligence agency sees rising threats. Denmark faces more external threats than it has done in many years amid rising geopolitical conflicts and doubts over US commitment to Europe's security. Military intelligence agency, the FE, said, according to Reuters, quote, "The world's great powers are increasingly prioritizing their own interests and using force to achieve their goals," FE said in its annual report, naming Russia and China among the nations posing challenges to Denmark. Of course, the US is also posing challenges to Denmark through Greenland, whilst also walking away from NATO, reducing forces, at least according as is the desire of the executive of the White House, wanted to pull forces out of Romania and Europe, American NATO forces, and seeing seeing Europe and the EU as the enemy, if you like, in their national security strategy. And that's something we will come to. Germany's army is now a top espionage target due to Berlin's support for Ukraine, says MAD Counterintelligence Agency. The Russian services are seeking intelligence on the Bundeswehr capabilities and weapons systems, German army, while sabotage and disinformation tactics intensify, says the Euromaidan press. And then finally, just before we move on to kind of where this goes, just another, I only picked a couple of incidents and sources here, but essentially all of Europe is finding that Russia is involved in all sorts of hybrid warfare activities. A group of German journalism students investigated the drone sightings over military installations in Western Europe, and in one instance tracked it back to 3 commercial vessels belonging to Russian services. So I presume this is the one where they had drones that were thought to be Russian, hanging over Kiel Canal, and I think ships and facilities in that neck of the woods. They've tracked them, these kind of, I guess, journalism students, volunteers in a sense, the cargo ships involved. So they tracked them back to commercial vessels in the sea that are Russian. The cargo ships involved are the Lauga, the HAV Dolphin, the HAV Snapper. The vessels were caught with drones circling over them and showing most unusual movements. Holy crapola. Yeah, we are now getting to a point where this goes beyond plausible deniability for the Russians. What we want to see is the Russians do. We don't want to see any of this, of course, but if the Russians are doing this, we want the Russians to do it in a way where they make a mistake and they can't have plausible deniability. Well, here, if we join the dots, there is evidence to suggest that actually the Russians really are overtly involved here, and they cannot plausibly deny this. So therefore, that kicks us into a greater united opposition to Russia. What you don't want is a fractured Europe that has permission to deny that Russia is doing this. What you want are the naysayers in Europe, the kind of AFD or the Reform UK law or Rassemblement National, National Rally in France, to say, oh yeah, no, it was the Russians. We can't deny now that it's the Russians. Okay, what are you going to do about that? Do you accept then that that is a threat to our national security, since they are doing espionage over our bases and our military equipment? You cannot deny that that is a threat to national security. Okay, it's a threat to national security. So now we're at a point where you, who otherwise would be sympathetic to the Russians, have to admit that the Russians are threatening our national security. Right, we need to be united. As Europe, as the EU, as allies to Ukraine, we need to be united in understanding that Russia are the bad guys here, because they're doing the bad stuff, right? And but all this comes at a time where the US has released its national security strategy and is pivoting away from supporting Europe, but also doing things that kind of don't support that stance, right? So they've just boarded what Trump says is the largest tanker in the galaxy, or whatever he said. They've taken control of a sanctioned Venezuelan tanker and are helping themselves to the oil on board. Now, what's going on there with Venezuela is remarkable in the context of Ukraine war, and could go a long way to explaining why the US administration might be somewhat tepid in their approach to supporting Ukraine and in condemning Russia. Because what the US is doing with Venezuela is, I'm afraid, what Russia has done with Ukraine. Russia invaded a sovereign nation because they want to help themselves to, among other things, their resources, their natural resources. Yeah, there are other reasons why they want to, why they invaded. Yeah, territorial expansionism, rose-tinted glasses, looking back at history, and this idea that this is the Ruski Mir, etc., and legacy for Putin, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but on a basic level, it's like invade them, help themselves to their, I don't know, rare earth minerals and whatnot in the Donbass region, particularly, right? There's no coincidence the Donbass region is the one that's being fought over most vociferously, because that is the industrial heartland of Ukraine to a large degree, right? Okay, so we condemn you for doing that. That is aggressive and it is imperialistic. At the same time, the Trump administration, in alignment with the thinking of the kind of Heritage Foundation lot, etc., produces a national security strategy that advocates for that kind of behavior and eschews essentially NATO and the EU as alliances. Trump doesn't think in terms of alliances, he thinks in terms of transactionalism, and sees everything as an opportunity to get resources. So if you look at the national security strategy, the tiny bit on Africa it's got, it sees Africa as an opportunity to go and exploit their natural resources. Well, okay, we're getting back to the 17 and 1800s and imperial expansionism to try and exploit areas of the world that are less technologically advanced, and that's what kind of happened in those periods. Is that what the US is doing? It wants to stake a claim on Greenland, Canada, Panama. So you got this expansionism. You got on the one hand this isolationism of putting up trade barriers around the United States and tariffs. So it's like isolating itself from an internationalist free market globalism, and literally putting up barriers on the border to stop people coming across the border. So it's isolating itself from the world in one sense, but in another sense, it wants to expand by having Panama and Greenland and Canada under its control. And then saying, well, Europe can be carved up by, I don't know, China and Russia, whatever. But by the way, we would like to do have a peace deal whereby we have access to the $200 billion of frozen Russian assets in Euroclear. And Europe, we as the United States want access to that so that we can invest in exploiting Ukraine and Russia thereafter. And so there's that economic, but not a kind of free market expansionism, but an imperialistic expansionism going on there, with kind of mercantile oligarchies with their fingers in a lot of pies. Okay, so you're seeing Russia as an opportunity rather than a threat, but NATO is saying formally, like the Secretary General of NATO, and NATO is an American organization, really. NATO Secretary General is saying that Russia are the biggest threats to NATO, and the US is going, no, they're not a threat, and they don't really mention Russia as a threat in their national security strategy at all. They only talk about democracy 3 times, and first time on page 16, and every time they talk about Russia is not in negative terms, really. And then you've got Putin meeting with the president of Iran. So the axis of evil continues, becoming stronger, says Anton Gerashenko. He said cooperation between the two countries was growing. Putin kept moving his legs, scratching his hand, and chewing his lip during this short speech. So make of that what you will. But yeah, that you've got this sense that that Iran are getting closer to Russia, and the US has just bombed Iran, right? So they know Iran are the bad guys. You've got North Korea helping Russia. Surely you can admit that North Korea are the bad guys, although Trump seems to have a love affair with, I mean, literally talked about kind of love letters in Trump 1.0 between him and Kim Jong Un. Is that the right one? Anyway, with Kim. But then you've got Venezuela, and you've got Putin coming out and saying, having phone calls with Maduro and whatnot. In fact, I'm going to find that now. So here we are. This is extraordinary, right? This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is the official Russian government claim. Presidents Vladimir Putin and Nicolas Maduro spoke over the phone. Vladimir Putin expressed solidarity with the people of Venezuela and reaffirmed its support of the policies of the Maduro government. So you have Russia very explicitly and publicly saying we're with Maduro. There are also Russian military personnel in Venezuela training the Venezuelans. Why? What training them to do? What? To fight. Who against? An American invasion. So on the one hand, you've got the national security strategy saying we're pivoting away from seeing Russia as the bad guys, and on the other hand, they're saying, oh, and by the way, we see Venezuela as bad guys, and we're going to invade them. But on the other hand, they're turning a blind eye to Putin, saying we're with Maduro, we're with Venezuela, and we're helping train the Venezuelans to fight the Americans. And the Trump administration is like, yeah, no, Russia aren't the bad guys, but they're literally going to be fighting against you. Like, what is going on here? It's absolute geopolitical insanity. And anyway, does my nut in. And none of it makes sense because that axis of evil is really overt. China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela, they're all hanging out together. And yet the US, from the Trump administration's point of view, I mean, the average Joe understands what's going on better than Trump and his administration, seems to be, on the one hand, China the bad guys, but actually we're going to sell NVIDIA chips to them. And then China goes, actually, screw you, we're going to make our own. So that was all the balls up. Trump capitulates to China at every conceivable opportunity, capitulates to Russia and wants complete appeasement, talks about love letters with Kim Jong Un, And then it goes hard against Venezuela because they want the oil. You know, you got Salazar saying we want to help, you know, Republican representative saying, you know, the number one reason we want to go into Venezuela is because our energy companies are going to line their pockets. Okay, so how does that look any different from what the Russians have done with Ukraine? Okay, it doesn't. So that could explain why you're a bit lukewarm on supporting Ukraine, because you want to do what Russia did to Ukraine to Venezuela. Okay, but then Russia is siding with Venezuela, and you know what? And at the same time, you've got US sides with Russia in a UN resolution on the Chernobyl disaster. So Washington's representative said the US voted against the resolution, not because it opposed nuclear safety measures, but because it objected to references to the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So the US siding in the UN with Russia. I do not understand this. And then you've got Representative Thomas Massie, who, yes, okay, he's a Kentucky Republican representative who's really good in the context of the Epstein files. So he's the one that's sponsored this bill with Ro Khanna from the Democrats to this discharge petition to publish the Epstein files. So he's great in that respect. But otherwise, he's a typical MAGA nut job. And he's now introducing a legislation calling for the United States to withdraw from NATO. And you're going to get support from, you know, Utah Senator Mike Lee, for example, and all sorts of others. But yeah, so the US, on the one hand, you know, sees NATO as, you know, the national security strategy doesn't like openly denigrate NATO. Still kind of pays lip service to it. But on the other hand, you're putting troops and resources out of Romania and out of Europe. You want European forces to take control of NATO Europe. You don't want the SACEUR to be the NATO commander to be American anymore. That seems to be the way you're going. And you've got representatives from your ruling party wanting to pull the United States formally out of NATO. And then you've got MAGA representative Anna Paulina Luna, who is a lunatic, inviting the Russian ambassador to her Christmas reception on Capitol Hill. It's absolutely disgraceful. She's Russian embassy. At the invitation of Representative Luna, ambassador Christmas reception on Capitol Hill. Wonderful event. Looking to make Russia-American relations great again. And she received a present from Kirill Dmitriev. So you've got assets inside the American government aligned with Russia. Here's Representative Luna again. The US is bankrolling the systemic persecution of Christians in Ukraine. Activists scream human rights until Christians are the victims. Stop sending American tax dollars to Ukraine, she said on the 8th of December. Jay in Kyiv says, the Russian government is just wholesale purchasing members of the US Congress, who then post outrageous lies to which this platform eagerly gives preferential treatment, so that's Twitter, pushing out to a massive audience. I don't think Musk gets out of bed in the morning without asking Putin first. You've got all of this going on, and the position of the Trump administration is, at best, massively incoherent. Because you can't be doing that with Venezuela and having your peeps rubbing shoulders with Russian ambassadors, producing a national security strategy like that, and denigrating Zelensky at every conceivable opportunity. None of it makes sense. The Kremlin calls Trump's new national security strategy a document that, quote, corresponds in many ways to our vision. France's former ambassador calls it a far-right pamphlet, and both indeed are right. The NSS dedicates 4 paragraphs to Europe's civilizational erasure, 1 sentence on ending Russia's war. Stephen Blank argues Europe and Ukraine now face a binary choice: build their own security architecture or watch Washington hand Moscow the victory it couldn't win on the battlefield. And to that point, we are going to go to the first YouTube excerpt here. And this is the Lincoln Square YouTube channel. This is Rick Wilson and others who are kind of former Republicans who are really, really worried about Trumpian politics. And here they talk about where this is going, like the national security strategy, where it's going to send Europe. And the US might not like, I've talked about this heaps, right? The US might not like it when Europe does stand up on its own 2 feet, like I said before. Oh, you guys, we spend too much money on you guys. You need to sort out your own security. So Europe then go and sort out their own security. Then they're completely independent of the United States, and they're not dependent on weapons. They're not buying all this stuff from American defense companies. And the US doesn't get to dictate what goes on in Europe because they no longer have NATO presence in Europe. And then, so then the American president says, oh, can you do this in Europe? And the Europeans say, no, bugger off. You've got nothing to do with us anymore. You kicked us out. You didn't want us to be dependent on you. So now we stand on our own 2 feet. We've got a burgeoning defense industry and we can make our own decisions. Thank you very much. And they don't involve you. And then the US has isolated itself.
Deeply. You know, when you got 80% of Americans who say we should be on the side of Ukraine and 80% of Americans who say Putin is to blame for this war, and you've got Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, the bag man, and Steve Witkoff, all doing these deals, sitting with Putin. You know, if Obama was doing the same thing, the Republicans would be calling for Witkoff to be arrested when he stepped off the plane and sent to prison for espionage.
Yeah.
Because Witkoff's in these meetings,
100%.
And we now have the transcripts, and not just transcripts, we have the tapes from European intelligence services, where Witkoff says, let me tell you how to keep Trump on your side. Let me help you keep Trump anti-Ukraine.
Let's just remind you that those transcripts and those tapes show Steve Witkoff offering to advising Ushakov on how to deal with Trump and on how to get Trump on side. So he's arguing from a pro-Russian point of view as an American as to how to manipulate the president of the United States. That, in any other administration, would be seen as treason.
Show you what to say to him to manipulate Trump. If someone working for Barack Obama said that, or somebody working for Hillary Clinton said that, or somebody working for any Democratic president in the history of ever, they would burn the city of DC to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand why, if you were prosecuting Witkoff for espionage or treason, whatever, why that wouldn't be your first thing that you put in front of the jury. Ladies 100%. And gentlemen of the jury, it is not only does he favor them, he is actively trying to coach them in how to work against American interest.
If you or I went to Russia and said, hey, we're going to help you improve your image. Here's some ads we're going to make for you. Here's some speeches we're going to write for you. Here's some ways to sell this war you're conducting against the Ukrainian people. I mean, that so it is unimagiable.
So Rick, I mean, where's Roger Wicker? Where's Jay? You know,
where's John Thune?
Where's John Cornyn on this?
Where's Lindsey Graham?
Lindsey Graham. You know, they all go over there and they do these photo ops.
Yep.
You know, which basically are looking more and more like kind of Jane Fonda photo
right
ops.
Going to Hanoi and sitting in a Vietnamese aircraft, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun.
Just a photo op. They've turned Article 5 into a photo op.
Yeah.
And it's will this just how does this end? I mean,
look, I had a conversation today with a European friend of mine who is,
and this is my point about Europe standing up on its own 2 feet. Is that actually what many in the US want? Do they want Europe to be subservient to the US? I guess from a hegemonic power point of view, the Americans would be like, yeah, we're the big dogs. Well, you push Europe away, Europe becomes one of the big dogs.
Very, very tied to defense and one of the major powers. And not nuclear power, but you guys can figure it out. Who said to me, and we've been talking about this off and on for a couple of weeks.
Right.
And this person said to me, you're going to get what you wish for. You're going to get Europe on its own. You're going to get Germany fully remilitarized. You're going to get exactly what you're wishing for right now. You know, Trump didn't like the NATO funding percentages. He's going to get something very different. He's going to get a Europe that is a singular military power in the world if it all decides that the Russian threat is what it is. And
this is almost the point of this video, right? Which is NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has come out and said, Russia the enemy. We're very close to war with Russia. You've got politicians in a lot of these major countries saying it. I mean, the problem for Europe is the rise of the far right, which we're just about to talk about after this, which is what the Americans are trying to foment discord and disunity in the EU by supporting the rise of the far right through Twitter and through their information warfare from the US, but they are wanting to tear some of these countries away from the EU because they just see it in terms of a kind of white nationalist Christian thing. But if Europe can overcome that threat, that internal threat, then you have a strong Europe that is not needing the United States.
And what folks have not realized and have not figured out yet is that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. That is a lesson that is not lost on anybody right now in Europe. And folks, if you don't think Germany could have nuclear weapons if they wanted them in about an hour, I got something to sell you, because they could. You know, but it's the lawlessness at the DOD, it's the lawlessness of the DOJ, and
so on and so forth. But I thought that's a really good little snippet there to give you a sense of the idea of like pushing Europe away gets Europe to be more independent of the US, and then it remilitarizes, and it doesn't need the US anymore so much, and the US can't control Europe so much. So what's the US trying to do is actually stop that from happening by pulling the EU apart. So Putin, both Putin and Der Spiegel knows this. The Der Spiegel cover, if I can pull that up again, had the cover the other day of Trump standing behind Putin, and these two kind of cooperating to carve up Europe. And yeah, sorry, I'm just going to find it on the fly for you. Here it is. So 2 villains, 1 goal. That's what the cover, that's what this means. So this is the Spiegel cover. This is Germany saying, you know, Trump and Putin are 2 villains who have 1 goal, and that goal is to carve up the EU, is to destroy the EU. Well, that's basically where we're going to go next. So in the context of the national security strategy, so an earlier version, it turns out the national security strategy was even more hardcore. And it said that the US should try to pry Italy, Austria, Poland and Hungary away from the EU. Wow. So Defense One reports, while the publicly released NSS calls for an end to perpetually expanding NATO, the full version goes into, it might not even be the earlier version, a full version goes into more details of how the Trump administration would like to, quote, make Europe great again, even as it calls on European NATO members to wean themselves from American military support, working from the premise that Europe is facing, quote, civilizational erasure because of its immigration policies and censorship of free speech. The NSS proposes to focus US relationships with European countries on a few nations with like-minded right-wing, presumably current administrations and movements. Austria with the FPO, Hungary with Fidesz, Italy with the three-party coalition, Poland with the PIS and Confederation are listed as countries with the US. The countries the US should work more with the goal of pulling them away from the European Union. Quote, and we should support parties, movements, and intellectual and cultural figures who seek sovereignty and preservation, restoration of traditional European ways of life. In other words, white, right-wing European nationalism, while remaining pro-American, the document says. Okay, right. So then we had this situation. So when Zelensky went to Italy the other day, he met with the Pope. We're going to hear from the Pope in a second, but also met with the Zelensky. During a meeting with Zelensky, Meloni used moral suasion on him on behalf of the White House. So now you've got Italy working against really Ukraine's interests for America's interests. So Meloni appears to have been turned somewhat by Trump. She's always been seen as a Trump whisperer, but has been supportive of Ukraine, has been someone who's been working for Europe, actually, even though you would have thought she'd be a bit Eurosceptic. She's actually come on board with the EU to some degree from her right-wing nationalist point of view, and has been fairly useful with the relationship between the EU and the US. However, she seems to have gone against this in line with maybe the national security strategy. She conveyed a message to Zelensky that could be summarized as follows, quote, be aware that you may have to make painful concessions. Meloni's team shares a view that Zelensky's position is weakened by corruption investigations within his government, and Rome sees its role in achieving a just and lasting peace plan, but with a priority given to the American line over the European one. Kiev has asked Italy to more actively participate in unblocking frozen Russian assets in Belgium and to participate in the Pearl program for purchasing American weapons. Remember, Italy stepped out of the Pearl program to buy American weapons because they said, well, there's no point spending money on Ukraine if there's going to be very shortly a ceasefire, and so on and so forth. Now, Tim White sees this even more darkly. Two pieces of news now which could be linked. Italian media report a tense meeting yesterday between Zelensky and Giorgia Meloni. It appears Italy's prime minister sided with Agent Orange, with Donald Trump in the White House, telling Zelensky to surrender territory. And meanwhile, Italy was named in a report tonight as one country the US wants to work more closely with. The report by Defense One, a reliable publication, names Austria, Hungary, and Poland as others Trump wants to prize away from the EU. A new C5 club was also planned. The White House hoped to replace the G7 with a group of mega nations with populations of over 100 million. Coincidentally, Russia still has over 100 million for the time being. China, India, and Japan were the others. However, none of this wish list made it into the final NatSec document. In other words, the original national security strategy, and we'll find out about who kind of helped to write that, Stephen Miller and a guy called Andy Baker. These people are seeing the world in terms of these great powers, which is reflected by just huge countries, big populations. So this is about China and Russia and India and the United States and Japan. And if we can prise some of these right-wing governments in Europe away, then they can work with us on making the world just a super right-wing authoritarian place. And I'm not going to read you the Italian news piece here, Corriere della Sera, but you can read the translation of what happened. You know, Ukraine, Meloni invokes painful concessions and supports US rushing into negotiations. The pressure on Zelensky in a 90-minute reading. So, you know, real pressure from Meloni on Zelensky to just fully accept the American appeasement plan. Then you've got Hungary working. So you've got Viktor Orban in Hungary working to become a forever leader. Bloomberg reports that Viktor Orban, one of the countries that the US wants to prize away from the EU, is preparing for life after the April 2026 election, where he's likely to get beaten by Tisha and Peter Magyar there, by planning a power grab through the presidency. So he's prime minister at the moment. He's seeking to become president. Orban is exploring how to rewrite laws to turn Hungary's ceremonial presidential role into the most powerful office in the country. So he's saying, right, if we can put things in place by April next year to make the president super powerful, like the president of the US, rather than that power resting with the prime minister, if I switch it to the president and then get myself to be president while Tisha take over, they'll actually be denuded of power. It would allow him to stay in charge. And if he can make that the most powerful office in the country. Right, now we're going to go to the and sorry, that's I didn't share that with you. That was the article in, is that Reuters or Bloomberg? Did I say that? I don't know. Anyway, it looks like it's Bloomberg. It's a Bloomberg article. Okay. And now we're going to go on to the rest is politics, where they are going to talk. And I could show you virtually all of this video. It's absolutely fascinating. But they're going to talk about the national security strategy with it in a little bit of detail. So both of these are sort of centrist people. Alistair Campbell associated with the Labour Party, Rory Stewart with the Conservatives, but both fairly centrist these days.
What that means is majority non-white. And that, I think, is what links this back to Vance, back to Project 2025. And we should be in no doubt. I go on a lot about, you know, too many governments that don't have a clear, long-term, compelling strategy. This is a clear, compelling, by their lights, long-term strategy.
I just had the delight of being on a stage with Alex Brucevitz, who many listeners won't have heard of, but almost all Americans will have done. He's the big America First Trump social media champion. He's 29. He now talks like Trump. His hand gestures imitate Trump. And I challenged him exactly about this. I said, you know, what I read the national security strategy. What does it mean that the majority will become non-European? You mean non-white, don't you? And he went, no. I just mean you're being overrun by people from poor third world countries who are violent and carry weapons and are going to destroy your countries and don't share your values, right? And of course, he has a part of a movement that has this new idea of heritage Americans. So well, I said to him, you know, what would happen if I said to you, America is going to become majority non-American within a few decades? What would you interpret by that statement, right? These people are European citizens. Talking about race, aren't you? It seems as though their idea is...
And by the way, that's a really important point. Like, our brains do lots of filling in the gaps and joining the dots without us really realizing what's going on. But when you talk about Europe becoming majority non-European, like, imagine if you said that to America becoming non-American. Well, what does that mean to be America? And America's made up of huge amounts of migrant communities, and the population is you know, built upon a foundation of migration. I mean, they're not all Native American Indians, are they? After all, so, you know, what does it mean to have a non-American population? What does it mean to have a non-European European population? And it does just look like a bit of a racial dividing line being drawn there.
Is that a real American is a non-indigenous American who arrived between about 1600 and 1850 voluntarily, and everybody else is somehow not really a real American in the same sense. And I guess the same vision of Europe. The other thing, though, that I don't get, and I'd love your view on.
This is the main part, though, that I wanted you to listen to. So, yeah, there's a racial component to the national security strategy for sure. And that's the work of Stephen Miller. His hand is going to be in that completely. But actually, this is the main nub.
This is, what is their long-term thinking? Because this is a policy that talks about making America strong and invulnerable, but doesn't actually name any of the actors, any of the countries that really threaten American strength and vulnerability. China, Russia, North Korea. Instead, what it does is it weakens allies and probably, I think, turns allies into adversaries. It dismantles organizations like the European Union, rearms countries in Europe, gets proto-fascist parties like the AfD into Germany, hands them big defense budgets, so creates a Europe with heavily armed nationalist governments without any European Union cover on it, and therefore creating a much more dangerous, unstable, conflict-prone world, which will give huge opportunities for Russia if it wishes to increase its influence in Europe. So
100%. And what you need to understand is that 27 member states together into one European Union becomes a very powerful trading bloc. And with that, it has all sorts of other political powers. But you disassemble that into 27 member states and you can control them far more easily. Russia could control Germany on its own rather than Germany as a part of, or more likely, Germany on its own than Germany as a part of the EU. Can certainly control Hungary more overtly rather than Hungary as part of the EU. And it's doing a pretty good job of controlling Hungary as part of the EU. But the United States could pick off different nations and say, right, we want you to do this. Oh, you don't have the power to stand up for us. You don't have the power to stand up to big tech, right? And this is where the national security strategy is very much a way of delivering what big tech in the US wants in Europe. And this is why when JD Vance came to Europe for the Munich Security Conference, you know, it is big on sort of freedom of speech. This is about big tech companies being able to say and do what they like in Europe without being regulated or taxed. That's why when they go and do big trade deals, the Americans with Canada, with the UK and with the EU, it's tech that is on the chopping block, or it's tech regulation that's on the chopping block. This is really super important what Rory Stewart is saying here.
All of this over the medium term makes America weaker, much more exposed, much less secure. So what's in their heads? I mean, they can't be stupid. So what are they doing? Why are they pushing a vision that will make exactly what they fear? Just as Musk, I think, is trying to create the civil war that he claims already exists in Britain. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was talking to somebody yesterday who's writing a book about Putin, and we were discussing what it must be like to be working alongside Putin the Putin of today rather than the Putin, say, of 20 years ago, when, you know, there was a debate about which direction he was going to take Russia in. We now know there's no doubt about the direction he's taken Russia in. And Putin is now surrounded by people. When we talked to Radek Sikorski, the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, he made this point that Lavrov used to be a kind of a foreign minister who was taken seriously because he injected into the debate, he had his own ideas. He's now just a complete vassal for a dictator. Now, I think what we've got with Trump is, you know, and I was thinking about, as this document was being put together, this security strategy, it is Trumpian through and through. He's written this introduction, and then everything that follows flows from that.
I would argue that Trump didn't write that introduction, and that Trump's views are actually a reflection of what he's being told by people like Stephen Miller and, as it turns out, a chap called Andy Baker. So I would somewhat disagree with this, because I think Trump is a mouthpiece for other people who are doing the thinking. But Trump would happily agree with that and align with all of that because he's super transactional, loves dictators. So Trump is very Trumpian. But I just think Trump is something of a puppet himself.
I think they really believe that this is going to make them the richest, most powerful country in the world ad infinitum. I think they believe that. Now, I think what I haven't heard is a sense of how the Democrats intend to handle this, because I think there is, let's just imagine, because Trump's ratings are falling. He keeps saying the opposite, but his ratings are falling. They're actually quite low for a serving president. Why? Because the economy is not doing that well for the people that he said he was going to help. Let's imagine it gets worse. And let's imagine the Democrats are able to make the link between the worsening economic conditions for working people and this isolationist, far more aggressive foreign policy. I think that opens an opportunity for the Democrats. But I think, honestly, Rory, I think the answer to your question, why are they doing this, is because Trump believes this is working, and all the people around him have to confirm that bias in everything they say and do every day.
One more question for you. Why on earth, if that's what you thought about the world and were doing, why would you say it? I mean, this is literally makes no sense to me at all. If you genuinely have a worldview where what you're going to do is screw over your allies, bully your way into their markets, weaken them economically, destroy the European Union, why would you say it? A traditional gangster would go around being polite. In fact, the traditional American policy, even when it was doing naughty things, was to frame it in positive language. You know, this is a partnership, we share values, we have common interests, etc. What I simply cannot understand is, if you believed this stuff, if you really were that cynical, that aggressive, really wanted to destroy the world order, it doesn't help you to say it so explicitly. Why on earth would you announce your evil plan? No Dr. Evil announces their evil plan.
Well, because go back to what we've said about Trump for some time, that he sees the world in very, very simple terms. America has to be the most powerful country in the world. No other country can threaten America. What happens over there is none of our business. So China, they can have another massive sphere of influence. Russia, they can do what they want. The one we worry about is Europe, because actually they can be a bit of a threat to us, particularly on the commercial business side. So Russia and China, they've read this report and they've thought, yeah, we like that.
Maybe domestic audience, authenticity, playing well with the MAGA base. I mean, maybe even if it's a mad thing to do to signal to Europe what you're about to do to them, maybe they're less concerned actually with the real impact of this, just more interested in creating media chat, provoking, keeping the whole reality TV show going.
But if you go back to what you said about Mike Pompeo, I think they will sit there and think, you watch, the Europeans won't fight back on this. So yesterday, for example,
and this is the final part of the bit we're going to listen to in this, which is, you know, and I've talked about this previously, is the bind that Europe are in, that the more they stand up to this approach, this national security strategy doctrine and rhetoric and actions from the American government, the more Trump can punish him. He's retributive, personally. He's transactional. and he will say, we're going to put another 20% tariffs on you, UK, if Starmer says any critical things against us, or if the EU stands up. And so you've got this kind of very weak response from the Europeans and allies of Ukraine, because they are beholden to the United States and the bullying characteristics and behavior of Trump. I've said to you many times, I don't think the Europeans are afraid of Putin. I think they're afraid of the ire of Trump, and not because they're afraid of Trump shouting at them, because of what then happens: trade wars and tariffs, and then the US saying, "Well, screw you guys. We're gonna help Russia, and we're going to lift sanctions on Russia."
Starmer made a point when talking about Ukraine about how grateful everybody was to Donald Trump for taking this forward and getting us as close as we have. Now, Mertz, to be fair to him, he basically said this, and there's a lot in the American paper that we really disagree with. Now, I think that is a better way to approach this. I think we have to call this stuff out, even though there's a risk to it. But the other thing, Rory, I wouldn't underestimate, part of me doesn't want to say this, but I think we've seen enough of Trump now to know that the guy's a complete narcissist. He believes that he's popular in the polls. He believes that the American economy is doing better because of tariffs. He believes that every country in the world sits there thinking, we just want to be like America. And on the thing about where the pen was held on this one, I mean, there are various sort of versions of this, but I know that it's quite a lot. I sort of do detect the worldview of Stephen Miller for sure.
100%.
But somebody who kind of is pretty well plugged in told me that the guy holding the pen in the latter stages was a guy called Andy Baker, who is National Security Advisor to Vance and Deputy National Security Advisor to Trump. So in quite an interesting position where he's covering both bases. And he is the guy who apparently in the pre-Munich was the one who was persuading Vance, we've already really go for them, really go for Europe and really go for Ukraine.
Almost certainly the guy that would have written Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. So then you start having questions about, well, can a national security strategy for the future direction of the United States of America be influenced that much by just such a small number of people? Like, this is where the United States is deciding it's going. But that decision is being made by Stephen Miller and Andy Baker, not by the Pentagon, not by Congress, not by the people, but just a very few crazy wingnuts who are super right wing, want to see a Christian nationalist United States, let alone a white nationalist EU, doesn't really mind Russia, couldn't give two hoots about Ukraine, wants to carve up the world among the big players.
Now, there's been a consistency to that. And I think that they'll be sitting there thinking, this is about American power. As you say, it is blatant and open now. We've said this, when he says America first, he totally means that, okay? But where they see it going is the American economy has to go well. They have to really win all this battle for rare earths and quantum and all that stuff, which he thinks they're doing, not least because of the tariff game that he's been playing. So if that succeeds, he will say job done. If it doesn't succeed, and my sense is it probably won't, then I think there is a massive opening to his opponents at home and his opponents abroad. The trouble with all his opponents abroad at the moment, they cannot out themselves as opponents because they're worried of the consequences.
Does that make sense? Yes. That's what I've been saying for ages. And I think I really wanted to play you a lot of that because it was, I think it's absolutely on point, not just because that I'm in total agreement with it, but it seems so on the money there. Now, Eurominded Press lays out the national security strategy and says it aligns with Moscow on 7 different positions. It wants to stop NATO expansion. So this is the American position, formally, wants to stop NATO expansion, wants to block Ukraine from NATO. Western European governments are illegitimate. EU weakens Europe. Nationalist parties have authentic interests. And it talks about being greatly optimistic. Well, there's great optimism about the rise of nationalist parties, or patriotic parties, as they call them. War ends on Ukrainian concessions, and they want to normalize US-Russia relations. So the strategy explicitly calls for Washington to cultivate resistance against EU-aligned governments by backing nationalist parties. Denmark's intelligence service, one of America's closest allies, now warns the US is using economic and technological strength as a means of power against partners. Wow. Okay. Now, just finally on the NSS, we have John Bolton saying, I will predict with total certainty, and he's a former national security advisor to Trump, that Trump hasn't read this national security strategy. He signed an introduction to it. I doubt he read the introduction. He doesn't care about it anyway. He doesn't have a philosophy. He himself doesn't have a design for American national security, doesn't even really do policy the way we understand it in Washington. And that's why the ramifications of Trump's approach are so dangerous. Again, goes back to that's, I'm in full agreement with that, because it goes back to Andy Baker and Stephen Miller and actually JD Vance having all of this power. And remember, JD Vance is a protege of Peter Thiel. So then you've got your Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Elon Musk, South African oligarchs with inordinate power. Remember, all the AI architects are on the cover of the Time magazine for being the person of the year. These people are hugely important, not least because they are massively rich and wield all sorts of economic, financial power. They are pulling the strings in the White House. JD Vance is on board with that. JD Vance's national security advisor is Andy Baker, who's written a national security strategy, along with Stephen Miller. No doubt Stephen Miller's fingerprints are all over this. And that is dictating the direction of travel for the United States. And the Congress are looking around going, "What? Hang on, what's going on there? We don't like that." Mark my words. And, when you've got the Pope coming out and saying, on the national security strategy, I'd rather not comment on that. I haven't read the whole thing. I think, unfortunately, some parts of it that I've seen make a huge change in what was for many, many years a true alliance between Europe and the United States. I mean, the Pope's nailed it. And then, so just finally, the final piece of the jigsaw is this kind of tech side of things. Now, you have just seen the EU fine, and rightly so, for a lack of transparency, have finally fined Twitter or X. And this has caused Elon Musk to attack the EU massively. But they've waited until, trade deals and conversations were done with the US. And now the national security strategy has come out. I think there's a permission structure with the abrasive, a confrontational attitude of the United States to Europe. It's now time for Europe to start flexing its muscles. And there is no coincidence that in the same week, Elon Musk was fined, or Twitter was fined, X was fined. And also they've started a case on Google's Alphabet. Alphabet is the company that owns Google. And also on one of the others. You had Apple as well previously. Which is the other one? Anyway, you've got the big Meta. So they've opened a case on Meta, Google, and they fined Elon Musk. I think you are going to see a bit of a war taking place with tech being at the center there, a bit of a trade, economic, policy, regulation war going on between the EU and the US. And the EU are probably deciding now's the time to do this because the US has just thrown us under the bus. And here we see Switzerland rejecting Palantir software. So this is your Peter Thiel guy. That's not Peter Thiel. That's the guy that runs it on a day-to-day basis, who, by the way, is pretty mad. Have you seen him speak? He gave us a chat recently on stage. And honestly, not that I've got anything against anyone with ADHD or anything like that, but the man, or maybe he's on drugs or something, but I've never seen a human being wriggle so much and move. But anyway, I think he's that's by the by anyway, but I think is a super dangerous guy. Palantir software poses devastating risks, according to Netzpolitik. After a risk assessment of the use of Palantir software in Switzerland, and by the way, we've just signed up to Palantir having access to our NHS data, I believe. I think the Tory government started that, and it may have been finished by the present Labour government. Palantir in the US with Doge and everything right in the center of it all. After a risk assessment of the use of Palantir software in Switzerland, the US corporation was rejected despite years of courting by authorities and the army. The Swiss considered the risks too great. The fear is that Palantir is handing over sensitive data to the US and from there to Israel. So wow. So yes. Oh, interesting. Careful. The CEO might have a snort another line of neurodivergence powder before screaming on stage that nobody likes him. Alex Karp, that's his name. So yeah, he's just an interesting person to listen to for many reasons. So, and then just finally, Trump said the other night in Pennsylvania, there's one country that probably has a stronger border. You know who it is? North Korea. North Korea has 7 walls of barbed wire, and each one is under the voltage of 1,000,000 volts. So if you climb over one, you won't live to see the next one. You've got Donald Trump exuding love for and envy for North Korea. So that's where you are. So you've got this tech authoritarianism linked with political authoritarianism, isolationism mixed with imperial expansionism, that kind of contradiction, seeing the EU as the antithesis of all of that. And the EU is the enemy, not Russia, but then Russia are together with Venezuela and they want Venezuelan oil. So Russia is the enemy there, but they can't be seen to be the enemy elsewhere. So that doesn't make any sense. And you've got China, capitulation to China, but at the same time recognizing that China is a threat, but actually then also saying, but then we want a world where China, Russia, the United States, India are just carving up all these little guys. And so the whole thing is a hot mess, and we're trying to understand in Europe, from my point of view, and we don't have the security blanket of the EU, so we're out there as a minnow in a tank full of sharks, as the UK. We need to work out, how do we deal with this? Well, how do we understand this? And what about US in 3 years' time after Trump? And what about Congress? And so crazy times, but unfortunately this has a huge impact on the outcome, I think, of the war in Ukraine, because the negotiation tactics of the US those objectives are in line with Russia and transactional exploitation of the situation for the gain of the United States without caring for the moral or political outcome for Ukraine. And so yeah, anyway, yeah, that was, sorry, I forgot to change the screen there to the statement on North Korea. But anyway, crazy times ahead, and I think the national security strategy is absolutely indicative of where the Trump administration is. In fact, it is the heart of, it is a beating heart of their foreign policy. Well, it is their national security strategy, but it's where they see the whole world, the Trump administration. It's where these movers and shakers in the Trump administration see, it's how they understand the entire world and how it should be. And unfortunately for Europe, we're way down the list of concerns other than being seen as adversaries. Let me know what you think. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.